Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. We are so excited to have you here for the third installment in our four-part webinar series, looking at research gaps related to gender-based violence among conflict-affected refugee populations in the Global South and other humanitarian contexts. My name is Beth Macklin, and I am a research specialist with the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm going to start the session with a brief introduction to our gap analysis, which is the basis for the webinar series, before introducing our fantastic panelists. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen to go back to slides. Okay. Our gap analysis, which you can find a link for in the chat right now, was focused on identifying research gaps on gender-based violence among conflict-affected refugees in the Global South. And this report and webinar series comes from our Building GBV Evidence program, which is funded by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And it seeks to strengthen the quality of GBV research in refugee and humanitarian settings. The gap analysis is one component of the program. Another exciting aspect of the work is a technical assistance portal, and you can learn more about the TA portal from the link in the chat. For our gap analysis, we sought to fill three main buckets of gaps: population gaps, which is who is missing from the research and evaluations that we reviewed; knowledge gaps, which is what do we not know, what still needs to be researched, and what research questions remain; and finally, methodological gaps, which covers study design, analysis, and implementation. For the gap analysis, we employed a three-step screening process where we collected publications through PubMed and Google Scholar for peer-reviewed articles. We then also collected gray literature from online repositories, as well as specific NGOs' online libraries. And finally, we did an internal GWI review with our colleagues, looking at the publications that we had collected in an attempt to fill in any missing pieces. We then segmented these publications into two tiers. Our first tier focused on publications from 2010 to 2020. It had to be focused on refugees, and it had to be focused on women and girls. Our second tier went back 20 years from 2000 to 2020 and included internally displaced populations and also included gender-based violence against other groups such as men and boys. After completing the sorting process, we coded these based on our gap analysis framework and then analyzed and synthesized the information into four thematic areas, which are distinct chapters in the report. And finally, after reviewing what we do know based on the existing literature, we identified gaps and proposed recommendations for moving forward as a community of researchers and evaluators focused on this population and on the issue of gender-based violence. It is important to note some of the limitations of our approach and process. We only reviewed publications collected through our search strategy, which may mean there are relevant papers and reports that we missed. The review only included publications that were publicly available online, which means there may be more information, particularly from NGOs' M&E portfolios, that were not available to us to review. And lastly, we only reviewed English language publications, and we know that there is more information, more research, more evaluations out there that were excluded because of language. I'm now going to provide a high-level overview of the gaps we identified related to today's topic. If you would like to learn more about the other gaps, please take a look at the report. You can also watch the recorded webinars 1 and 2, which the links are in the chat now. And then you can also join us for our final webinar session, which will be in the next couple of months. So the basis for today's discussion is the population gaps related to countries and context. The first gap we identified is about the countries and more broadly regions where research was focused. Sub-Saharan Africa was the most represented region among the collected publications, with 2/3 of the literature focused there. The vast majority of these papers and reports came out of 3 countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda. The Middle East and North Africa, or MENA region, was the second most represented, included in about a quarter of the publications, with most taking place in Lebanon and Jordan. Then less than 1/5 of the publications included the experiences of women and girls in South and Southeast Asia, specifically coming from Thailand, Bangladesh, and India. And then finally, barely a handful of studies were conducted among refugee populations in Latin America and the Caribbean, with none from outside of South America, and only one study came out of Central Asia. The countries and regions represented in the literature we collected do not reflect the current distribution of refugees in the Global South. While the majority of studies we collected were conducted in East Africa, more refugees are hosted in South Asia and the MENA region. It was quite surprising, for example, to find only one study from Turkey and none from Pakistan, given that these two countries are in the top 5 of hosting refugees, according to UNHCR data. And the second gap was limited examination of refugees' experiences related to GBV outside of rural contexts and among host communities. Almost 2/3 of the publications we reviewed focused on rural populations. And among those, the vast majority were conducted in camps. Rural populations were more prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, while urban populations were studied mainly in the Middle East and South America. And among those urban-focused studies, the majority of refugee populations exclusively lived in integrated settings. And the urban-rural divide we found represents the opposite of the current refugee experience. While 60% of refugees live in urban settings, 60% of the collected research was conducted in rural areas. In addition, refugees living in peri-urban and suburban integrated communities and settlements are increasingly common, though few, if any, studies have examined the unique needs of refugees specifically in these settings. And so these are the gaps that serve as the basis for our conversation today. And we are going to hear about research from places where refugee and host communities largely live together in some of the countries that have received less attention in the literature. And now I'm very excited to move on to introduce our 3 panelists. I'm going to give short verbal bios now, but as each one presents, a longer bio with links to some relevant publications will be put in the chat for your reference. So first we have Rassil Barada, who is a research, evaluation, and learning consultant based between Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Beirut, Lebanon. Her work in Lebanon focused on building evidence on GBV programming at Abad, a humanitarian organization that provides gender-based violence prevention and response services to refugee, migrant, and host community residents of Lebanon. Second, Dr. Sarah Treves-Kagan is a behavioral scientist at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, Division of Violence Prevention. Dr. Treves-Kagan's areas of expertise include health equity, identifying structural determinants of violence, and preventing adverse childhood experiences, sexual violence, and intimate partner violence. And finally, Katherine Gambir is a GBV and sexual and reproductive health professional and humanitarian researcher, and currently serves as Senior Research Advisor at the Women's Refugee Commission. Katherine leads the conception and implementation of robust research and evaluation initiatives on sexual violence and child marriage in humanitarian contexts. And before I turn the floor over to Rassil, just a quick note about the Q&A, which will happen at the end of the presentations. As questions arise, please post them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. When I moderate the Q&A, I'm going to be looking to that box. And so if you post a question in the chat, I won't necessarily see it. And if you have a question for a specific speaker, please include their name in your question so I know who to direct it to. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm so excited for our discussion today. And with that, I turn it over to Rassil Barada.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Beth, for the introduction. Amazing. All right, so I'm Rassil. I'm excited to present data and research on individual level risk factors for GBV among refugees in Lebanon. Next slide, please. So I'll lead with some context on the current situation in Lebanon to provide some insight into the unique structure of camps and living spaces for refugees in Lebanon, setting the stage for the types of physical spaces that refugees live, work, and have mobility in. And I'll then present some individual level GBV risk factors for refugees living inside and outside of formal camps, focusing on the differences between risk inside and outside those camps where the data is available. And then I'll end with what's missing from the data. Next slide, please. So Lebanon is currently facing an acute humanitarian crisis driven by three primary factors. One is an economic collapse that is defined by the World Bank as one of the top three economic crises in the world since the 19th century, plunging over 80% of the population under the poverty line. And so reliance on import in the Lebanese economy has meant that the government now isn't able to provide more than a couple hours of electricity per day, and that the price of food has gone up by 215% annually since 2020. That's also exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has killed so many and disrupted supply chain management for medicine, food, and other supplies in an import-reliant economy, and has also caused spikes in intimate partner violence. And the third is the 2020 port explosion in Beirut, which claimed the lives of over 230 people, displaced 300,000, and can still be felt by those living in Beirut and resulting areas. And refugees, of course, are already prone to economic vulnerability and living in smaller and more crowded spaces, and so face these challenges more severely. Next slide, please. So Lebanon hosts the highest number of refugees per capita globally and is home to between 183 and 300 Palestinian refugees, and the number is really unclear, about 18,000 of whom fled to Lebanon from Syria in the early 2010s. It also hosts about 1.5 million Syrian refugees, about 2 in 3 of which are registered with UNHCR. The employment market in Lebanon often restricts women's labor opportunities to domestic housework, posing an increased risk of GBV due to the lack of accountability and reporting mechanisms. This, in addition to the tension between host and refugee communities, are key framing points for differential power dynamics between host and refugee communities in Lebanon. Next slide, please. So where do refugees live in Lebanon? Lebanon is kind of unique in that it has different physical structures available to Palestinian versus Syrian refugees, and that most refugees live in and integrated with host communities as opposed to informal refugee camps. So as you can see on the slide over here, about 45% of Palestinians live in formal refugee camps in the form of residential buildings, most of which are in urban settings. And except for one camp in Saida, which is in southern Lebanon, called Ain al-Helwe, it's difficult to really distinguish between non-camp residential buildings and the camps themselves, as there are really no clear dividing lines. And these camps have their own political system represented by militias and armed groups. They also have their own ambulatory services and civil defense, and are served by a specific humanitarian agency, which is UNRWA. And then Syrian refugees are largely integrated within their host communities as opposed to living in formal refugee camps where GBV risks have been better documented. And so the Lebanese government has refused to establish formal refugee camps for Syrian refugees. So over 1 million of these refugees live in cities, villages, or informal tented settlements, or ITSs. About 31% of Syrian refugee households share overcrowded lodgings with other families, and about 18% live in fragile makeshift tents. And the remaining 9% live in non-residential structures, including garages, shops, work sites, or farm buildings, and that is often dependent on the work that they do. And humanitarian actors primarily provide services in the camps or in static centers such as Ministry of Public Health primary healthcare centers or Ministry of Social Affairs social development centers, and that's important for framing for future slides. Next slide, please. And so because the primary focus of this panel is on individual level predictors for GBV among refugees, specifically living outside of camp settings, one key question to ask is if physical spaces are predictors for GBV. So these physical spaces can mean the lodging itself, whether it's residential buildings shared with host communities, the garage of a Lebanese employer, or an apartment rented by a Lebanese person to a Syrian or Palestinian refugee. It could also mean the spaces in which refugees work, some of which will predict what type of lodging they have. And it could also mean the physical spaces in which refugees are mobile, such as public transportation or spaces travel to reach services such as health or education services. Next slide, please. So there's really, really limited data on gender-based violence among Palestinian refugees, and even more limited data for refugees living outside of the formal camps. The data that does exist shows risk for different types of GBV for boys and girls, exacerbated by increasing poverty because of the economic collapse, online and social media presence, and cyber exploitation and abuse for girls specifically, stay-at-home orders and overcrowded lodging, causing increased confrontation between family members. And this was a study specifically in refugee camps, so I'm not really sure how that would be different outside of that. And living with men or boys in the same household. So, for example, one study that focused on qualitative data collection for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon showed how, although boys see themselves as their sisters' protectors, girls' narratives about extreme violence in the household almost always include brothers and not fathers as perpetrators of violence. This is because older brothers are often tasked, including by mothers and fathers, with monitoring and controlling girls' behaviors to prevent girls from compromising family honor. So there's family like honor violence and honor killings as a result of that. And the presence of armed groups in the camps makes many feel unsafe, and they use this as a justification for child marriage in order to protect unmarried girls from these militias. But these militias don't really exist outside of the camps. And so I'm not really sure how this would translate to Palestinian refugees living outside of camp settings. And then outside the home, women and girls are at an increased risk of GBV by the militiamen themselves. Those living inside and outside camps may also be prone to sexual exploitation and abuse by humanitarian aid workers, though there's limited data on this that's disaggregated for Palestinian refugees specifically. Next slide, please. There are also unclear distinctions between camp versus host community residents in terms of domestic violence, examples of which include kind of intimate partner violence or non-partner violence, for example, within informal tented settlements, which is exacerbated by women participating in income generation activities, being separated from family members as a result of the conflict, having a disability or chronic illness, younger age, as well as other factors such as higher number of children. So those who live outside of camps actually may have to travel farther to reach services. So this is for GBV outside the home, may have to travel farther to reach services because of what I mentioned before about how sometimes services are provided inside the camps. So sometimes they would have to cross checkpoints and interact with military personnel. Other risk factors may include debt to business owners, such as supermarkets, traveling long distances to schools. For example, some camps have schools embedded in them. So living outside the camps may actually mean that children have to travel farther and leave their place of residence to pursue an education. So that increases their chances of experiencing violence in transit, such as sexual assault on buses or walking to school. And sexual exploitation and abuse, and though that's unclear if there are any differences in this risk inside versus outside camps. So survey results showed that in one study by Gina and Osta, that there was exploitation and abuse, specifically sexual exploitation and abuse by military personnel, and that there is a perception by Syrian refugee adolescents that a lot of this violence is perpetrated by host community members specifically. And then there was a study actually done by GWI, yay, that there was sexual exploitation and abuse associated with certain types of aid, such as food, wash, shelter, and cash assistance, though this wasn't disaggregated by place of residence, such as inside or outside camps. Next slide, please. So some of the key differences between living in camps and non-camps that may change the risk of gender-based violence are access to services. So distance to services may be larger for those outside of camps, like I mentioned before. There are checkpoints placed pretty consistently throughout certain parts of Lebanon where refugees are most concentrated. And those were placed before the refugees came, but really pose a hurdle to refugees, especially those who are not documented or don't have any legal paperwork with UNHCR. And that specifically kind of increases risk of GBV for Syrian refugees, but not necessarily Palestinian refugees, because they have different legal statuses. And then the tension between the host community and refugee community is cited actually as a primary driver for GBV by some adolescents in a study by Susan Bartel et al. And so living among host community may actually highlight tensions between these two communities, increasing exposure to violence, or at least causing differential power dynamics, which we all know increases the risk of violence. The living spaces themselves, landlords are a primary perpetrator of non-partner violence. And so debt to a landlord may increase risk for transactional sex because of those differential power dynamics. And then the last is crowding. So residential buildings may be less crowded and offer more privacy than, for example, informal tented settlements where multiple families live in the same tent. But it's really unclear how this would affect GBV. There isn't a lot of data on that. Next slide, please. So what's really missing from this data? The first is disaggregation between camp versus non-camp data collection. So most Palestinian refugees in Lebanon live in formal fenced camps, or not really fenced, they're just in Lebanon, you know where they are when you enter them, but if you come from the outside, you can't really tell. That are integrated into the city, whereas most Syrian refugees live in residential structures scattered throughout the host community. But most of the data that I've come across doesn't distinguish between those living inside camps and those living outside camps, and there's a severe lack of data for Palestinian refugees. And so one, gathering more data, but also disaggregating that data based on place of residence may highlight some differences in risk. There also is a lack of longitudinal data on GBV risk. So most studies are cross-sectional. So how might our conceptualization of risk change if we conduct longitudinal studies? And that's linked to disaggregation between data collection in acute versus protracted crises. So Lebanon has gone back and forth between being an acute crisis and being in a longer, more protracted crisis. So currently it's in an acute crisis, but for years before 2019, it was in a protracted crisis as a result of the influx of refugees. And so the type and quality of data may differ substantially, especially if participants are experiencing an acute emergency and may not wish or be able to discuss gender-based violence. But also the type of risk itself may change in these different settings. And so I think more data or disaggregated data on the type of crisis that's currently going on may be helpful. Thank you.
Rassil, thank you so much. And thank you. There was so much there. I'm really glad that you touched on that protracted versus acute crisis, because I know we're going to get into that a little bit more in the Q&A. So I'm glad that you kind of dropped that in early for people to maybe start thinking about that. And we're going to keep it moving. And so I'm very pleased to now turn over our virtual floor to Sarah Treves-Kagan.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. And you can see my slides okay?
Yes.
Cool. And just before I get started, I just want to, well, thank everyone for being here and also acknowledge that it's been a hard week and a hard few weeks in the context of violence prevention. Not hard few months, hard few years, decades in the field of violence prevention. I just want to take a moment with this group of people who are all so dedicated to preventing violence to just take a moment to think about all the people that we are serving and their families. And also to take a moment to just think of something beautiful in our lives to kind of hold on to in these really difficult moments. I'm thinking of my two sweet girls who are 3 and 5 and whose giggles are just really wonderful points of joy for me in these very difficult times. Okay, so I'll get started on my presentation. So I'm Sarah Treves-Kagan, and I am with the CDC. And I will be presenting data from 5 studies today. So I'm just going to apologize in advance. I won't get to talk about any of the details, but please, please, please ask questions. All of the studies come from the Ecuadorian-Colombian border, looking at IPV among women living in conflict-affected areas. And just to note that the findings and conclusions in this presentation are those of myself and do not necessarily represent the official position of the CDC. And I also want to acknowledge this was actually not a CDC-funded study. The government of Spain funded this study via the World Food Program. And I just want to acknowledge our study participants, of course, and all of the wonderful collaborators. So the Ecuadorian-Colombian border regions have been deeply affected by decades of violent conflict in Colombia that only recently officially ended in 2016. Exposure to trauma and violence from government forces, left-wing revolutionary groups, and right-wing paramilitaries was ubiquitous in Colombia and spilled across borders. Sorry, I'm losing my voice today. The conflict also resulted in over 7 million displaced people. Most were internally displaced, meaning they were forced to move to other parts of Colombia. But hundreds of thousands of refugees fled the country. Most of those refugees relocated to Ecuador. And unfortunately, over the decades, Ecuadorian public sentiment towards Colombians soured. And Colombians face severe psychosocial stressors, such as discrimination, poverty, and violence in Ecuador. And of course, the conflict also had significant impacts on communities, stressing social fabric and safety nets of the community. The region has simultaneously undergone rapid changes regarding gender equality. In the 90s, both Ecuador and Colombia made IPV legal and have signed onto several international treaties to prioritize ending violence against women. The country has also made enormous progress in equalizing access to education for girls. However, significant gender inequality still exists. For example, women are significantly more likely to be living in poverty, be unemployed, and not have access to resources compared to men. So within this context, we sought to better understand IPV. And while IPV can impact all genders, these studies focus specifically on IPV against women. And historically, this research has focused on characteristics of the woman to identify risk and protective factors despite strong theories, and suggesting that partner, household, and community factors matter a lot and likely influence each other. So research on these higher level risk and protective factors is limited, particularly in Latin America and among conflict affected populations. And so we had to understand, why do we see increased risk of violence of IPV in conflict affected areas? Is this related to economic strain, psychosocial stressors, strains on the social fabric of the community, household or community gender norms in this context, exposure to other forms of trauma, or some combination of all of the above? As I mentioned, these studies explore these gaps in our knowledge using data from northern Ecuador, which shares a border with Colombia. And the data comes from a food, cash, and voucher transfer project. So in April 2011, the World Food Program expanded its assistance to address the food security and nutritional needs of Colombian refugees and low-income Ecuadorians in these areas, and to support the integration of refugees into Ecuadorian communities. The new program consisted of 6 monthly transfers of cash, vouchers, or food, and were conditional on attendance of monthly nutrition trainings. In addition to improving the food consumption of poor households, a goal of the program was to improve the role of women in household decision-making, particularly related to food and nutrition. The value of the monthly transfer was standardized across all treatment arms and was equivalent to $40 per month per household. And that was about approximately 11% of the household's pre-transfer monthly consumption. To evaluate the program, 80 communities were randomized to receive one of the three methods, so either cash, food, or vouchers, or to a control group. And the neighborhoods that were randomized were characterized by high concentrations of displaced Colombians and over 50% of the population living below the poverty line. Survey data was collected from households within these neighborhoods at 2 time points, with 2,357 households completing baseline surveys, and 2,122 of those households completing a follow-up survey approximately 7 months later. 2 years after that, researchers went back and collected qualitative data to better understand how participating in intervention impacted family and household dynamics. So, I'm so sorry. The researchers found that the food voucher and cash transfer project increased food security and quality and decreased IPV in all of the intervention communities, regardless of modality. And when they conducted their qualitative data, they conducted a mixed methods analysis and found that kind of the three main mechanisms through which this reduced IPV was a reduction in day-to-day conflict and stress in the couple, improved household well-being and happiness, and increased women's decision-making, self-confidence, and freedom of movement. All of this was in the context of receiving the food, money, and vouchers and participating in a program that was specifically designed to feed their children, which fits within the traditional gender norms of the area of women being responsible for the emotional well-being of their children. So the next three studies that I will briefly present the results on were a secondary data analysis of these studies. Rassil mentioned a lack of longitudinal data, and so we took advantage of having two surveys at 2 time points with the same household to conduct a longitudinal analysis exploring, for this study, social disorganization, social cohesion, and IPV. We also took advantage of the data structure, so households nested in neighborhoods, to be able to look at some of the neighborhood level factors that might influence household level IPV. So for this study, we looked at social disorganization theory, which posits that concentrated disadvantage and residential instability erode social control mechanisms like social cohesion and collective efficacy to address social concerns, such as a high prevalence of IPV, which then facilitates increases in violence. So we conducted a multi-level mediation analysis and found that women living in a neighborhood with higher social disorganization were more likely to experience intimate partner violence than those who were living in neighborhoods with lower social disorganization. And our mediation analysis found that neighborhood civic engagement partially mediated this relationship. So this means that, and so we saw, for example, that as neighborhood social disorganization increases, neighborhood civic engagement decreases. And when civic neighborhood engagement decreases, IPV increases, or vice versa. So women living in neighborhoods with higher civic engagement experienced less IPV. We also found at the household level, reflecting what Teal was saying earlier, that household psychosocial stressors, such as being robbed or losing a job, being injured, or experiencing discrimination, increased risk of IPV, and household social support, decreased risk of IPV. Yeah. Our next study used the data to kind of test this like traditional feminist theory around the status of women in a household in a neighborhood to see if that influenced risk of IPV. And in fact, we did find that women's education and decision-making were associated with IPV in the direction we expected. So if a woman in her own household had higher education or had higher decision-making, she was less likely to experience IPV. But also, if a woman was living in a neighborhood where women on average had higher female educational attainment or on average had higher decision-making in their household, independent of what her own decision-making or education was, she also experienced lower levels of IPV. The economic indicators didn't act in the way that we expected, but I'm going to skip that because of time. And lastly, this is a study that Colleen Keaton led, which was a mixed method study, only looking at Colombian women in our sample. So all previous studies that I talked about had both Ecuadorian and Colombian women. And this one was just Colombian women. And using both qualitative and quantitative data, what she found was that participants, many of whom had been living in Ecuador for years, described living in a state of liminality, which is this kind of ambiguous in-between state of kind of legal, economic, and physical insecurity. And they described how their lack of legal residence and documentation, violence experienced along the life course and the kind of migratory continuum, social isolation, including loss of support networks and restricted mobility, and lastly, financial stress, all exacerbated their risk of IPV and made it more difficult to leave it. So overall, we found that economic stability, household and community gender norms, education and economic equity for women, community civic engagement and inclusion, and trauma and discrimination were all really important factors in women's experience of IPV. And I will just name that prevention strategies that have been identified by CEC in their intimate partner violence and sexual violence technical packages, as well as the WHO's Inspire technical packages, have outlined some, I think, really relevant strategies that can be used simultaneously to prevent IPV in these settings. So that's it. And these are the study references. And I will share all the documents in the chat.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You covered such an incredible amount of information in that 15 minutes, and you stuck to time. And so thank you for that. And also, I just wanted to acknowledge and say thank you for creating that space for all of us at the start of your presentation, because this has been a challenging moment. Oh, Kitty.
Yes,
and
here's another point of joy in my life.
And it's sometimes hard to pause and just acknowledge and create that space. So thank you for that. And thank you for your incredible presentation. We are now going to move on, and Katherine is going to bring us home with our final presentation. So the floor is yours, Katherine.
So much, Beth, and thank you to the other panelists and all the participants for joining us today. I will be presenting on findings from WRC's research and pilot interventions that were conducted in 4 urban humanitarian contexts, which engaged host communities for more inclusive and integrated GBV programming. So this research and the pilot interventions were conducted as part of WRC's project called Mean Streets. This project was a multi-year grant to improve the humanitarian community's understanding of and response to GBV risks in 4 urban contexts. The following 4 cities, Kampala, Uganda, Beirut, Lebanon, Delhi, India, and Quito, Ecuador, were selected as project sites for this field research, as well as the pilot interventions. They were chosen not only for their geographic diversity, but also because they are a host to diverse refugee populations, have different policy and economic environments for refugees, and we're also at different stages of humanitarian response. So this project explored the specific GBV risks of the following refugee subpopulations: women, girls, men, boys, people with diverse OGS, persons with disabilities, and sex workers. So the first phase of the project was formative qualitative research to explore refugees' perspectives about their sense of safety and well-being in their cities, their own GBV risks, as well as those of their family members, other community members, what GBV risk mitigation strategies they're currently using, and what suggestions that they have for refugee service providers going forward. And to note, this research was conducted by former WRC colleagues Jennifer Rosenberg and Anna Myers in Kampala, Delhi, and Quito, and by Jen in Beirut. Jennifer also led the analysis and interpretation of the findings that I'll be presenting today, with support from the following partners in each of the sites who are listed on this slide here, who provided guidance as well as logistical support during the site visits, as well as interpretation and feedback on the findings. All right, so for this formative qualitative research, this was conducted between February and August of 2015. 28 individual interviews and 48 focus group discussions were conducted in the 4 cities. Participants included refugees, as well as UNHCR staff and UNHCR's local partners. So this included both traditional humanitarian partners, as well as other community-based organizations, NGOs, and civil society organizations. In addition, a qualitative survey on the topic of refugees engaged in sex work was also administered to refugee participants to gain more information and document their perspectives on this topic. Okay, so next I'll provide a very high-level overview of the key findings that resonated across all 4 sites. For additional information about the key findings and what was particularly unique in each site, you can access the link to the full report. So a common theme that emerged across all 4 sites is the interrelation between GBV risks, urban poverty, and lack of access to basic necessities, such as livelihoods and food and shelter. So risks related to livelihoods included that refugees face discrimination in searching for work, domestic work and sex work were very common across all sites. Transactional sex occurred not just among women and girls, but also among adolescent boys and male youth, men, and people with diverse OGS. Refugees also reported both public and private modes of transport were rife with verbal abuse and unwanted touching by both passengers as well as by drivers. And in addition, many refugees were pressured to take night jobs or nighttime shifts, which heighten their vulnerabilities. Other risks related to shelter. So most urban refugees are responsible for finding and paying for their own shelter in urban contexts. And they face many barriers in doing so, including landlords' discrimination against refugees, either refusing to rent them or exploiting their lack of options to extract higher rents. Refugees also reported having to move very frequently and being evicted abruptly, leaving them homeless and exposing them to increased GBV risks. Within the shelter itself, there's also a risk of GBV in refugees' homes by family members, by landlords, and by neighbors. Many individuals were also lived in shared occupancy housing, either as an individual or with families, and that also left them vulnerable to physical and sexual abuse by their housemates. A third area of GBV risk was urban isolation. So what we mean by this is refugees are feeling completely disconnected and alienated from their surroundings and their community, their physical community. They associated feeling vulnerable to GBV and being loners in their community without social capital and without community ties. They reported being targeted for violence by both refugees and host community members because it was assumed that as refugees, they wouldn't report the incident. Refugees also spoke about living in fear of being reported to law enforcement because of their refugee status, and also forced to endure abuse and exploitation because they never knew when a threat to report was real. And finally, I touched a little bit on this earlier, but public spaces and transport were also a physical space in urban contexts where refugees experienced violence. Refugees were harassed and verbally assaulted, including threats of rape, unwanted sexual touching, and rape, simply by walking through the city streets, buying groceries at the market, or waiting in line in the restroom, including incidents of gender-based violence occurring in schools. So from this study, we also learned about effective urban risk mitigation strategies. So I'll share 5 of those key strategies next. The first is strengthening relationships with both host community and the municipal actors. So one best practice is that humanitarian actors should conduct a mapping of the local organizations that specialize in working with individual subpopulations. And this social capital between humanitarian staff and staff working for host community organizations will improve through personal relationships, mutual trust, and ongoing communication. So in the successful integration of refugee integration, we learned that both humanitarian as well as local actors who they emphasize the importance of humanitarian actors' openness to listening to the local organization and being open and collaborative in listening to the local organization's challenges in providing services and integrating refugees within their services that were originally or traditionally focused just for host community members. The second is strengthening protected peer networks. So peer networks in urban contexts already exist, and they offer different types of resources and support to refugees. Or there may be certain peer networks for certain subgroups of the populations, including LGBTIQ networks. And these networks are particularly useful because they can be entry points for refugees to build social capital and access services and other community resources. So the third effective strategy is building assets and capacities. So this is really about using a strengths-based approach that leverages existing assets and capacities of individual subgroups rather than just focusing on individualized needs. Fourth is employing a multifaceted outreach strategies for subgroup populations. So this is especially, again, around this peer-to-peer outreach. Fifth is meeting urban refugees where they are, asking them about their needs and issues and involving them in designing solutions to meet those needs. So following this research and these findings, a WRC partnered with 4 local organizations in each urban context to pilot GBV prevention and response interventions. And each of these pilot interventions employed more than one of the 5 GBV risk mitigation strategies that I just spoke to. Due to time, I'll only speak to the 3 pilots in Kampala, Beirut, and Delhi. Great. So in Kampala, we partnered with Reproductive Health Uganda. They're a national sexual and reproductive health service delivery organization based in Uganda, currently now an IPPF affiliate. And we worked with them to train refugee women engaged in sex work to be peer educators in both Kampala as well as in a nearby refugee settlement, Naka Valley. And this intervention was designed to address information, service and support gaps affecting these women. It took both an evidence-informed and rights-based approach to working with these women in order to strengthen their skills and capacity to mitigate GBV risks and improve their health and safety. The next pilot intervention was in Beirut, and we partnered with Mosaic, an operational LGBTIQ rights organization in Beirut, where we brought together both Syrian, Iraqi, and Palestinian trans women refugees, as well as Lebanese trans women for art and drama therapy to improve overall psychosocial support and skills building. Overall, the pilot results showed that there was an improved well-being, sense of self-worth, processing of past traumas, and physical safety and security, as well as an expanded peer network that provided other avenues for refugees and Lebanese trans women to share information, knowledge, and resources. And for the last pilot that I'll be speaking to today, this was conducted in Delhi with Don Bosco, which was a UNHCR national partner. And we worked with Don Bosco to establish community-based GBV task forces that cohered around national origin as well as neighborhood location. So Don Bosco held workshops with these GBV task teams to share information about GBV topics, as well as other areas of interest. These GBV task force also worked with local police and provided targeted assistance to at-risk community members. So to wrap up, there are 4 common themes across all of these pilots. First, we worked with a diversity of host community partners with specialized knowledge. Really effective urban protection and GBV prevention cannot be achieved by humanitarian actors alone. It requires engaging a broad network of non-traditional partners. This can include police departments, school boards, health clinics, civil society, and community-based organizations. Second, as discussed, each partner or each pilot engaged more than one GBV prevention risk mitigation strategy. Fourth, each pilot employed targeted outreach that tapped into existing community networks, including that peer-to-peer approach. And finally, interventions were targeted based on specific risks, opportunities, and subgroups. So finally, the key takeaway I want to leave everyone with is that preventing GBV against urban refugees requires increased collaboration between humanitarian and local actors with specialized knowledge. It also requires tailored interventions and targeted outreach. And this is especially important for marginalized subpopulations. And finally, national and community-based actors, namely feminist and women-led civil society organizations, are really best placed to lead this GBV prevention and response in crises. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Katherine. And thank you, Rassil, Sarah, Katherine, for incredible presentations. I think that over the last 45 minutes, we've really kind of had a nice progression and a nice journey thinking about individual level factors, community level factors, and then how do we engage with community partners and the communities that we're intending to serve to develop meaningful interventions to improve, to prevent violence and improve outcomes and livelihoods and just the experiences and well-being of urban refugees and refugees living in integrated communities. So thank you, everyone. And we're now going to move on to the Q&A. We have about 30 minutes for that. I'm going to start with some questions for our panelists. I see that some people have already started putting questions in the Q&A box. Please post your questions there, and we will do our best to get to all of them. And so the first question, when thinking about working in and with integrated communities, I wonder if each of you could speak about kind of the unique or specific ethical considerations that researchers and evaluators need to be aware of and need to think about when focusing on refugees in a host community instead of in a camp setting. And so I think we'll go in the same order as our presentation. So Rassil, Sarah, and then Katherine.
That's a great question. I think I'm going to do it by type of refugee, like by nationality. And for Palestinian refugees specifically, if they're living integrated into a host community, sometimes people don't know that they're Palestinian. Because a lot of them have been living in Lebanon for so long that they like use the same dialect as we do. And they typically like work informal jobs in the same way that some Lebanese people do, kind of within certain socioeconomic brackets. And so working with them, one ethical consideration is making sure that you're not necessarily being explicit that you're working with Palestinian refugees. There's a lot of tension between some communities in Lebanon and Palestinian refugees. That's specific to certain political sects like the Phalangist political party that massacred a lot of Palestinians in the civil war. And so making sure not to out people as Palestinian refugees if they live outside of those camp settings. And making sure for Syrian refugees and other refugees living in spaces with host communities, like those informal like residences that I talked about, like garages and farms, making sure to be mindful of the current tension that exists with service provision. So a lot of the tension that's noted between host communities and refugees is a lot of Lebanese people hold resentment towards refugees for receiving more services, which quantitatively, I don't know if that's actually true. But because of existing tensions between those two communities, making sure that if you are targeting refugee communities integrated into host communities, to also offer services to vulnerable host community members in order to provide them with services because that's the human right, but also because that increase in tension may actually exacerbate forms of violence, including gender-based violence.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I was not involved in the original food cash and voucher transfer project, but my understanding of how they designed the program really reflects what Rassil just said. They specifically chose communities with high concentrations of Colombians and also Ecuadorians living below the poverty line, and included both populations in the program. And while their primary goal was to increase food security and increase kind of the nutritional quality of the food people were eating and children were eating, they also had the goals of helping integrate Colombians into their communities. And so in addition to providing these transfers, they had these kind of nutritional and cooking classes where women in general could come together, both Ecuadorian and Colombian, and learn about nutrition and cooking. And as we saw that, like, civic engagement, which could be going to church or it could be participating in like an agricultural, like farming meeting, or going to these nutritional classes, is a really important way for women to start building communities and support systems, and can be very protective. So I think that's one thing. I think I can't remember, Beth, if you were also asking specifically about like research methods, but I will just say that when the data was collected, the data collectors, when they got, a lot of their questions were about like what people were eating and like their, just kind of these kind of benign questions about their households. But when they got to the questions about intimate partner violence, they followed a very kind of rigorous ethical process as outlined by the WHO in terms of collecting information on GBV, specifically making sure that the woman was alone when she was answering these questions, offering services if she reported IPV, and just letting all women know if they reported it or not, because we know that some women are not comfortable reporting IPV, what services were available in their community.
Great, thank you. Katherine?
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I think the earlier points also resonate with WRC's work conducting research and these pilot interventions in urban contexts. So this tension, as well as the basic right to access services. So this also is incorporated, of course, in our research, which is informing effective service provision. So it's not only targeting refugees, although that may be what the donor, the overall project is focused on, but also including host community members in the research to understand their needs, to better integrate programming for refugees. So this also speaks to resiliency of refugees in urban and non-camp settings. That is the goal, is self-sufficiency. And this also involves, not only this physical space, shelter, but also attaining livelihood opportunities and reaching full, complete well-being. So this, we of course abide by the sphere protection guidelines and ensure that all people have access to that assistance according to their need without any discrimination. Some other areas, speaking to research in urban contexts, based on my experience overall, I would say camp settings offer more rigorous data collection is often easier to conduct in camp settings, given that it is a confined space, whereas in urban settings, there's really a lot of mobility among non-camp population, so it's hard to track people over time. It's also a lot more diverse populations. If we're talking about an intervention, an evaluation of an intervention, there is often a lot of movement across this urban context. So they do have access, and that spillover effect can also be implicated. So I think generally urban settings in particular are more challenging for more rigorous research design and methods overall.
Great, thank you all. And so my next question relates back to a point that Rassil made, and this was thinking about acute versus protracted crises. And when working in urban environments, how does the way we conduct research focused on GBV change depending on that kind of crisis dynamic? And so again, Rassil, I'm going to start with you since you had already touched on that during your presentation. And then to mix it up a little bit, we'll go Rassil, Katherine, Sarah.
Sure. So I will say that sometimes in acute crises, you can't collect data on GBV. I think that like, despite the fact that we know that GBV increases during acute crises, a lot of the times that we've tried to collect data, not necessarily through like research, but in like monitoring and evaluation, and kind of programmatic data, people are less willing to talk about gender-based violence when they're experiencing an acute crisis that affects basic needs, like physiological needs, like their lack of access to food, lack of electricity. And this doesn't necessarily speak to the importance of talking about gender-based violence, but that sometimes ethically and culturally in Lebanon specifically, I can't really speak to other places, there's a tendency to deprioritize talking about gender-based violence when there's an acute crisis. So just kind of being mindful of the questions that you're asking, and also being mindful that there may be increased like spikes in types of violence. So when asking questions, some types of violence may be more fresh, so you kind of need to think about that ethically as well. But also when you're asking questions about gender-based violence and collecting data, make sure to link to services that target the type of crisis that you're in. So if you're in an acute crisis and people have been displaced, you don't just want to make sure you want to make sure you're asking questions about gender-based violence, of course, but you also want to make sure at the end of the interview to link people to shelter services, to food services if their food supply has been compromised, to make sure that you're addressing people's direct needs as well as kind of doing that really important data collection on gender-based violence.
Thank you.
This is a really important question. So not only speaking to the phase of the humanitarian crisis, but also the nature of the crisis, whether it be conflict, disaster, that also affects the type of information that you're collecting and what you're doing with that information. All information that's being collected has to be applied. It must be action driven in humanitarian context. The humanitarian community can do a much better job at mainstreaming GBV indicators in other sectors. So, for example, Rassil was, pointing to what are refugees or displaced persons' immediate needs. It doesn't often go straight to GBV. Certainly, GBV response is life-saving response. When you think about clinical management of rape and IPV and so forth, that medical and psychosocial first aid is time-sensitive and life-saving. However, refugees overall also may have additional priorities, such as livelihoods, food insecurity, shelter, wash. So it is imperative that we don't lose sight of GBV amongst the other priorities. Therefore, the information that should be collected should be on GBV should be integrated within those food insecurity assessments. In acute emergencies, again, so there is a need for those data rapid assessments, whereas in more protracted settings, such as, let's say, Borno State in Nigeria, where there's more, intermittent violence, a mix of both camp and non-camp settings. There's more, I would say, luxury of more rigorous methods to be applied to generate more generalizable knowledge for mixed methods and more longitudinal approaches. And this is to inform broader humanitarian prevention and response strategies. Where in acute settings, this is more data gathering for immediate action to feed back into the humanitarian clusters and framework.
Thank you, Katherine.
I'm not sure I have as much practical knowledge or advice to share on this point, but I do think there are a couple of things that like this kind of collection of data or collection of studies we did in Ecuador kind of pointed out to me, because the Colombian conflict lasted for decades, and many of the people in our study had been living in Ecuador for many years. But as you know, the last study I presented on talked about that they really felt, they never felt settled. They never felt like they got to like become part of the community. And I think something that really spoke to me is that, well, one, to this point about longitudinal studies, the group that did the original study had a really high rate of success of collecting data, 7 months, at 2 time points, 7 months later. Almost all the households re-participated in the survey, even in the control group. So in this kind of protracted setting, even though it was urban, there seemed to be a little bit less movement. But what I wanted to say was really more about the research questions, I guess, as less about the methods, in that like our studies really highlighted the ways in which like these women and communities were struggling with some of their basic needs, even though they had been in this space for a long time. And they are still women and human beings in the sense that like they really wanted, they didn't feel a sense of community, which is something that they seemed to lament, which I think all of us can probably relate to after the pandemic and sitting at home by yourself for 2 years. It's really bad for your mental health. And then to be in that kind of environment where either you're scared to go outside because violence has spilled over the border, or because Ecuadorians have a bad idea about Colombians and so they're experiencing discrimination. It's a really long-term stressor, and it's a real kind of lack of support that people need. And also things like romantic jealousy, like these are still partnerships, and so they're experiencing acute and long-term stressors, and they are still managing the dynamics every other, partnered couple is managing in terms of raising kids, and likely aren't getting a lot of support in the way that we would want couples to have support. So I think just in terms of kind of the questions we're asking in these protracted studies, I think there's room for questions beyond kind of immediate concerns. Might have gotten disconnected.
We can still hear you. You did freeze momentarily, but we could still hear your entire answer.
Okay, great. Well, that's all I had to say.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So I'm now going to move to the questions we have in the QA box. And so our first question says, I work in Colombia. I'm curious about recommendations for how to do psychosocial support with women involved in collective action, given the context of continuous risk to GBV, IPV, and other forms of violence. And so that is not directed to anyone specifically. So I would first ask, does this question jump out to anyone? Does anyone want to respond? And then we can go from there.
Can you hear me?
Oh, go ahead, Sarah, go ahead.
Yes, we can hear you.
No. Okay. I mean, I'm not 100% sure kind of what, I think Gina is the one that asked this question, what Gina is asking, or what she's looking for. But I can just say 2 things. One, just participating in collective action, I think, is extremely powerful and extremely critical, both for communities to improve the safety and livelihood of everyone, and also individually for those participating in it. And two, as you know, all of us who are on this call are clearly involved in IPV prevention in some way and trying to prevent violence. It's very difficult work, and especially in contexts where there may not be support for collective action and there may be severe repercussions. And so, you know, of course, trying to support people in accessing as many kind of support services as possible, both to make sure that their basic needs are being met in terms of food and housing and safety, but also mental health and self-care, and having to be strategic in the collective action in terms of managing people's safety. So people engaged in collective action often have varying levels of privilege, and so can those with the most privilege do the work that may have the most consequences, or can those who, like, kind of matching the consequences with the activists that it will be the least burdensome to, if that makes sense.
Katherine, did you also want to answer that?
Yeah, thank you. And just following on Sarah's point around the importance of collective action and ensuring that the group takes an intersectional feminist approach. So ensuring that, you know, oftentimes those involved in collective action are those with the privilege to do so. So understanding whose voice is at the table and who we're amplifying is really important. But overall, that's seen in the research a really effective strategy for preventing and mitigating GBV risks and promoting community level prevention. We know that, you know, feminist women-led organizations and civil society organizations, so inclusive of that, the collective action approaches, are best placed to address GBV prevention and response. They know the community is best. They understand the social norms and the gender norms that are perpetuating these patriarchal norms that perpetuate gender-based violence. And they know how to combat this. Speaking specifically to improving psychosocial support, I think as well as a sort of more like a practical recommendation, and also specific to the webinar and urban context, we do have available, which we can share after, an urban community service mapping. So allowing organizations to really, and you know, women themselves and girls, other community members at risk, to map the available services in the community and also identify and discuss with them, well, what are the barriers and facilitators to accessing those services? Specific to MHPSS support and services and resources, but also looking at it very holistically, because we know we can't address mental health and psychosocial needs through one sector. It needs to be an interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral approach at both individual, community, and societal levels. Thanks.
Wonderful. Rassil, before I move on to the next question, did you have anything that you wanted to? No? Okay. Just wanted to check. Okay, so our next question in the Q&A box, it looks like it's specific to the work done in Uganda, so Katherine. And I think what the question is getting at is related to refugees who engage in sex work and how we can reduce the vulnerability that they experience as sex workers, and how we can kind of reduce risk and improve the safety for these men and women.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks, I believe it was Dr. Wandera from Macquarie University. This is a great question, and I think also I read it partly was that for clarification for the research and then the intervention, it was not promoting sex work. We, through the research, identified that sex workers have increased vulnerability to GBV. However, we also understand that sex work for some people may self-elect into sex work. And if it is truly, something that they want to do, then that's a different question. But of course, if there are no other livelihood opportunities, which is often the case, and the only opportunity for them is sex work and they're coerced into that, then that of course is what we're primarily focusing on here. We did find from the research that it wasn't just women who were engaged in sex work, it was also girls, it was also boys and men and people with diverse socio-ask. Of course, when we talk about sex work and transactional sex among adolescents and minors, this is not sex work. This is sexual exploitation in the context of selling sex. So I also just want to make that clarification. So in this intervention itself, it was really about engaging this refugee group. So these women who are engaged in sex work, vulnerable to GBV because of the work that they're doing, the power dynamics at play, and training them to be community ambassadors in their own community to drive change. This also improved their own skill sets and capacity building around negotiating for condom use, building their skills and knowledge about accessing sexual and reproductive health services, consequences of sex without protection, and so forth. This also built again, going back to the importance of having that social capital and a social network to improve overall well-being, which has been highlighted in all of the different presentations across all these really diverse contexts. So this was also facilitated through that work with the peer educators. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. And so we have one more question that is a really big question that I'm not sure how much detail we're going to be able to give, given that we only have a few minutes left. But the question is, how do you measure outcomes and success of any GBV response? And so I wonder if anyone would like to jump in and maybe just think about what specific kind of variables or outcomes were being measured to think about whether a response was successful or not. And so Rassil, I see you nodding. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, I can do that. I would say it depends on three things. One, if you have the luxury to do rigorous data collection. So we talked about kind of acute versus protracted crises. Sometimes you don't have the time, and people don't have the interest in participating in rigorous data collection or specific types of research. Two is if you have the resources. Impact evaluations are incredibly expensive and take a very, very long time. And so that's one thing that we need to think about. And three, if there's a capacity to do impact evaluations and kind of differentiating between regular kind of program monitoring and data collection and impact evaluations, which can like really determine causality between like the intervention itself and the outcomes. And so I think that like it really depends on those three things and potentially some other variables that I can't think of on the spot. But I would say those are three things to like really think about. And determining the outcomes themselves, I guess it depends on the outcomes that you listed for the intervention itself when you developed it, or kind of were moving through it.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add also that there are a lot of resources available to help with these kinds of evaluations. So for example, the WHO has a pretty standard list of indicators to measure, for example, intimate partner violence. And there are other resources to measure other forms of trauma or migration-related indicators. And so there's no need to reinvent the wheel because there are a lot of resources available to support.
Thank you, Sarah. Katherine?
Yeah, I'm going off of Sarah's comment. There are validated questionnaires and tools that have been validated across the globe, including in humanitarian settings, to measure different types of GBV. I think it's also important to consider what is appropriate and when. So going back to Rassil's point around what information we're actually collecting. It is incredibly important to understand the ethical considerations required for collecting information about GBV. This is incredibly sensitive, personal. We don't want to re-traumatize individual survivors. So if you don't have to ask about personal GBV experience, do not do it if you're not using that information proactively. So oftentimes there are other ways that you can ask a question to get at, instead of asking, for example, a common question used in surveys is, in the past 12 months, have you experienced IPV from a partner? Something like that. Instead, you can use the neighborhood method, or you can ask, do you know anyone in your community who has experienced intimate partner violence over the past 12 months? So in this way, it's not a personal question, and it's not as traumatizing or re-traumatizing for an individual participant. Although there are validated tools, I would also insert terms of quantitative measures, especially when you're working with survivors, when you're working with adolescents, other marginalized groups. I would encourage folks to use participatory methods as a way to get more information and explore really the risks, the experiences, and the consequences of GBV from participants. Again, they can have an opportunity to speak from their own experience as well as from people like them in the community. A lot of these concepts, GBV, IPV, sexual violence, they're very conceptual. This is not necessarily language that everyone across the world uses. So it's really important, and it could be a best practice moving forward to first actually work with community members themselves and develop indicators to measure the outcomes you're trying to see with community members themselves, so that you're creating indicators that make sense and that people can actually respond to. So you're collecting valid data.
Catherine, thank you so much.
I know we're out of time.
Oh, Sarah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing to what Catherine was saying. I totally agree about the point of not wanting to re-traumatize anyone. And I also just want to name that there have been a lot of instances where engaging in an interview process or data collection is one of the few safe spaces women have to share that they're not safe in their household, and to get resources and to understand if they have other options in terms of not being in that unsafe space. So people get very nervous about asking questions about violence, which I understand that historically it's considered a very private matter, and we don't want to re-traumatize anyone. We don't need to ask them details about what happened, but I think it's also important to recognize that when there are opportunities to provide resources, that we take advantage of it.
Thank you. Well, that is all the time that we have. And actually, one, I would be remiss if I didn't throw out this one resource that the Building GBV Evidence program has, which is the technical assistance portal. So if you are specifically looking to develop measures for an evaluation or for a new research study, please look into the technical assistance portal, and we would be happy to engage with you on that work and see if this is an opportunity for collaboration. And so, Katherine, Rassil, Sarah, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your work and your insights. This has been an incredibly valuable conversation. And I would also like to thank the team at the Global Women's Institute who helped support the webinar today. This includes Angela Barasa, Jesse Weber, Skylar Wynn, Maureen Murphy, and the wider team, Liz Hedge, Deviani. So everyone at GWI, thank you so much for your support in another wonderful webinar, and please be on the lookout for our fourth and final webinar, which will be likely in July or August. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Take care of yourselves. And yeah, thank you so much for being here.